We should be skeptical of a lot of climate change science, because an awful lot of it is politically manipulated. Okay? There are lots of people who, for political motives, want to sell the idea of anthropogenic climate change. However, I believe, even though I have that view myself, that it's a profound mistake for people who are of the classical liberal or libertarian persuasion to spend all of their time attacking climate science, given that most of us are not qualified to speak about these matters at all. And I'm including myself in that category. So I think for the sake of argument, we should assume the worst case scenario. Assume that climate change is happening. Assume, secondly, that it is largely human-induced, that it's anthropogenic climate change, and then think through, in this worst-case scenario, what a classical liberal or libertarian response is to this particular topic. That's the kind of approach that I'm going to be taking in this presentation. I'm going to deal with one specific aspect of the climate change debate, and that is around an issue which is often described as the question of climate justice. The question I'm going to deal with is, should developed nations who are high emitters of CO2 pay some kind of compensation to developing countries who may suffer the consequences of various climate changes? Now, this is an argument that's been made. The argument in favour of compensation is an argument that's been made by egalitarians, as you might expect, but also this argument has been made on libertarian grounds as well. In this presentation, I'm going to argue that in the case of countries which want to have economic development, developing countries that want to have economic development, there is no case, either on egalitarian or libertarian grounds, for compensation to be paid. However, I'm going to point to a class of problems where I think the libertarian view, and actually all other theories of justice, simply are unable to cope with the nature of the issue in hand. And this is when we deal with relationships between countries that want to develop economically and those, assuming that they exist, that don't wish to develop economically, but which may nonetheless suffer the consequences of developmental decisions which are made in other countries. In these cases, I believe there is no theory of justice to determine what should actually be done, who owes what to whom in these particular cases. That's the argument that I'm going to make. So I'll divide the talk into three parts. I'll start with a brief summary of what the egalitarian and the libertarian arguments are for paying compensation to developing countries. I'll then criticize those in the second part of the talk, but then in the third part of the talk I'm going to move on to this class of issues where I think there is no adequate solution, either from libertarianism or from any other political perspective. Okay, so let's start with the egalitarian argument first of all. Okay, egalitarians claim that the developed world owes compensatory payments to developing countries. The argument basically is that it's the developed world which has caused problems associated with anthropogenic climate change. It has received benefits from engaging in these polluting activities, and that people in developing countries are going to be paying the costs of these. They pay the costs in a number of ways. They could pay the costs in terms of just having to deal with the effects of climate change, having to build flood defense systems or whatever it may be. They pay the costs in terms of having to adapt to climate change, as a consequence perhaps having lower economic growth than would otherwise be the case. And they could suffer the direct consequences of climate change through rising sea levels or whatever it may be. So these are all costs, it's claimed, which are being imposed on developing countries as a consequence of the actions of people in the developed world. So compensation, it's claimed, should be paid in these situations. Now there's a moral view which underlies this kind of an argument. It's basically the view that if you're dealing with a finite natural resource, and in this context, the finite natural resource is the capacity of the global climate system to take in, to absorb CO2 emissions without creating some kind of catastrophic climate change. If you're dealing with a finite natural resource, then access to that resource is based on some kind of principle of strict equality. that everybody should have an equal bit of ecological space. This is the term that's often used. And egalitarians are basically claiming in this context that because the developed world has grabbed an unfair share of this ecological space, its development has come at the direct expense of people in the developing world. So that's the injustice which needs to be compensated for. That's the kind of argument that egalitarians make. But the argument for compensation hasn't only been made by egalitarians. You can make a kind of libertarian argument in favour of compensating people in developing countries on the grounds that their property rights, or the property rights of individual people within developing countries, are being threatened by or breached by the actions of people in the developed world. Okay? So, if you are facing the consequences of anthropogenic climate change, it's the equivalent to somebody pumping out fumes from a factory and polluting the washing that's hanging out on somebody else's lawn. It's a form of pollution which isn't being taken into account in those decisions. People's property rights are being breached, either directly through the pollution itself, or perhaps indirectly through climate change, which is being sparked by the pollution, and the fact that people have their beachfronts inundated with water, whatever it may be. These are externalities, if you like, which are breaching the property rights of people in the developing world. Not to do something about this will be to go against a central tenet of libertarianism, which is the non-interference principle. People should be able to do with their property as they see fit, provided they're not interfering with the capacity of others to do likewise. And the climate change pollution is seen on this view to be a direct interference with that right. It's actually compromising the decisional autonomy of people in the developing world. So what is the argument that's used in this context by libertarians coming from this point of view? Well, typically they would argue for the introduction of some kind of injunctive relief, so that in theory people in the developing world should be able to apply for some kind of injunction to require that developed countries stop emitting CO2. Then, having achieved such an injunction, they will be in the position to demand compensatory payments from the developed world if they want to actually resume the CO2 emissions. Okay? So you give people a property right, you enforce that right if they want to receive compensation in terms of the damages that they're receiving from people in the developed world. That's the kind of argument. A second argument might be that there should be compensation paid for past damages. Okay? All of the emissions that have gone out in the past, there should be compensation paid for the effects of those damages on the property of people in the developing world. So that's a kind of libertarian sort of argument. And it's an argument, if you're skeptical of it, that you should remember is rooted in the idea that the decisional autonomy of people in the developing world should be respected. That their property rights, their right, if you like, to pursue their own life without interference should be respected, and that climate change represents a potential breach of that right. So that's the kind of argument that we have. Now, I want to criticise both the egalitarian argument and the libertarian argument before moving on to this difficult class of questions where I think there is actually no clear-cut answer. I personally do not believe there is any case for compensating people in developing countries where people in those countries have a goal of achieving greater economic development. Okay? I think there is no case for compensation. And I'll take both the egalitarian and libertarian arguments in turn to try to demonstrate why I think we should reach that conclusion. Okay, the egalitarian argument basically assumes that people in the developing world are the victims of decisions which are being made by people in the developed nations. Okay? It also works on a very narrow interpretation of what in political philosophy is known as the Lockean proviso justification for having private property. So, on the Lockean view, private property is justified, people can acquire property, use resources, provided they leave enough and as good for others. And in the case of climate change, the egalitarian argument is, well, people are not leaving enough of this good for others. They're taking too much of this ecological space, not leaving enough for people in the developing world. The problem is with this interpretation of the Lockean proviso that it's ignoring what the Lockean theory is really about. The Lockean theory isn't really saying, literally, that when people acquire property, they can leave enough and is good for others, because that can never be the case. The argument is that by enabling people to own property, you expand the range of options which are available for people, even those who aren't actually able to acquire property. Okay? Now, this argument applies this more nuanced understanding of this Lockean proviso to thinking about the question of use of ecological space. It's true that people in the developing world today don't have as much access, if you like, to pristine ecological space as developed countries had at one point in time. But it is not true that these countries are hapless victims of what has happened in the developed world. There are a number of reasons why they're not victims. First of all, economic development in the developing world has been made easier precisely because the developed world has already gone through the process of industrialization. Okay? When you've had societies which have gone through the process of industrialization and the institutions that go with it, they provide role models which are readily imitated, which mean that development can take place much more quickly than would otherwise have been the case. So you have a kind of imitative learning effect, where people in the developing world can develop quicker than will be the case if they were the first to actually be engaging in the exercise. You can look at very basic figures on this. So in the Industrial Revolution, it took something like, a country like the UK, something like 100 years to double national wealth. If you look at countries in the last sort of 20 or 30 years, South Korea's done it in 15, 20 years. The time has come down precisely because countries have got access to cheaper technology which have previously been developed by other countries. They can learn by imitating what has happened elsewhere. This argument applies in the case of economic growth, but it also applies in terms of facilitating developing countries having economic growth for a lighter ecological impact than would otherwise be the case. It's precisely because some countries have gone through a dirty process of industrialization that the prospect of cleaner growth, growth which doesn't use as many natural resources as was previously required, has been opened up through the same kind of imitative learning effect. Technologies which initially were developed in the developed world, which were highly intensive in their use of resources, have facilitated a lower use of resources for countries who are trying to develop now. That is a gain for those countries. They can develop economically now without using as many natural resources as would have been the case if they were going first. This kind of argument also applies to the use of clean technologies more generally. Okay? Clean technologies which are available now, such as solar, wind power, all these sorts of things, are to a large extent parasitic on the fact that there's already been a process of carbon-intensive growth carried out by other countries. Many of the components which are required for these clean technologies wouldn't have existed if there hadn't been a dirtier process of economic growth taking place earlier. What happens in all of this is that there's an evolutionary chain where some countries have got to go first, they've got to be dirty in order to facilitate cleaner development for other countries at another point in time. When people make the argument for compensation, if they actually want to develop themselves, really what they're complaining about is the fact that they just didn't happen to develop first. Okay? They're not arguing against development per se, they're just complaining about the fact that some other countries were the ones who developed first. So there's no moral argument here, I don't think, for compensation to be paid, given all of these uncompensated benefits that these countries are actually receiving. So that's my critique of the egalitarian argument. But remember, there's a libertarian argument here for compensation as well. This is the argument that if people's property rights are being breached by pollution from activities going on in the developed world, people should be able to apply for injunctive relief against this, requiring that the pollution stops, but then people can charge some kind of compensation payment in order for resumption of those CO2 emissions. There are a number of things wrong with this argument. First of all, the injunctive relief argument can only apply if countries are themselves not wanting to develop economically. There's something in the common law tradition known as the clean hands doctrine. You can't demand that other people stop what you yourself are about to start doing. So you can't, in this context, demand that other people stop producing CO2 when you're about to start producing CO2 yourself. In order to stop people from doing that, you have to have clean hands yourself. Well, developing countries that want to develop do not have clean hands. In effect, it goes back to the previous argument, what they're complaining about is the fact that they haven't developed first. Okay? And what I would say in this case is that in any evolutionary process, you haven't got any pure principle of justice to decide who goes first in these kind of evolutionary chains. It's simply a question of who does it. That's about as close to any kind of principle that you can actually come up with. So the injunctive relief argument I don't think works. But someone might come back against that and say, well, what about compensation for previous damages which have been done, okay, by CO2 emissions? Well, here again, I don't think there's an argument for compensation. It may be true that there are damages that people in the developing countries face as a result of previous CO2 emissions. But if we're thinking about this in terms of some kind of rectificatory justice, we also have to take into account the uncompensated benefits that have been received by these countries in the past as well. Now, in this kind of case, I don't think there's any way practically to work out what the cost-benefit equation is in any particular case. You couldn't tell what the distribution of income would be, what the differences in the distribution of income would be, say between the UK, the United States, and China and Brazil, if the US and the UK hadn't engaged in the level of CO2 emissions that they did in the past. To be able to say what the difference would be, you'd have to work through all of the investment decisions that these people would have made, all sorts of different decisions which would have been made with those assets that we can't estimate. There's simply no way of knowing in these situations whether the benefits, the uncompensated benefits, exceed the costs. We've got no counterfactual of what kind of decisions would have been made in the absence of the decisions that have actually been made in the recent past or over recent history. So I don't think you can make a solid argument there for compensatory payments to be made either. How would you actually calculate what this is, or whether any kind of net loss has actually been incurred by the countries concerned? Okay, final part of the talk. I want to move on to what I think is an area where the libertarian approach, but actually not only libertarianism, most other political traditions as well, have got no conceptual tools to actually deal with the nature of the problem at hand. What about relationships between countries which are wanting to develop economically, which are producing CO2 or will produce CO2, and countries or people, if we want to take countries out of the equation, people who do not want to have economic development? So just going against very slightly the previous talk, what about those people who do want to live a monastic lifestyle, or may be happy with some kind of tribal form of existence? That is what they see as being a desirable life. But nonetheless, these people are going to have their lives interfered with as a consequence of decisions which are being made elsewhere. They could be inundated with floodwaters, they could face changes in their lifestyle which are being brought about by the actions of people in other countries. Now, this seems to me to be a case where there isn't any clear solution to the problem. And let me try to explain why. Essentially, the problem with the global climate is that there are no property rights to the global atmosphere. Okay? Property rights in any situation determine who has the rights to do what and who is actually committing an externality type defense. So if I own the right to a clean atmosphere, okay, and you're polluting my right, then I can charge you for compensation. If I own the right to pollute and you don't want there to be any CO2, you've got to pay me to actually take the pollution away in that situation. So externalities are a double-edged sword. Okay? It's not one thing or another. It depends who actually owns the property rights concerned. Now the problem that when we're dealing with climate change is that A, there's no way of assigning property rights to the global atmosphere. But B, and this is the most serious problem, even if there was a way of assigning property rights to the global atmosphere, it's not clear what principle of justice you could use to determine who should have these rights. Why? Because in this situation, we're not in the Lockean proviso type situation where if somebody acquires property, it enlarges the range of opportunities which are available, even for people who don't acquire it. We're talking about what in effect is a winner-take-all scenario. Whoever gets the property right basically has everything. So let's have a thought experiment. Imagine you could enforce property rights to the global atmosphere. Okay? And imagine for the sake of argument that the people who own these rights are the tribal peoples who want to lead an ascetic sort of life, not having any economic development. If such a right could be created and could be enforced, those people would have the right to shut down the entire global economy. Okay? That's what the right would be about. Now, people in developed countries or would-be developing countries could come to them and say, look, we'll pay you compensation, okay, if you allow us to pollute. But a property right is only valuable if you can say no to the compensation. And the whole point about these people's lifestyle is they don't want the compensation. What they want is to live a pristine life, okay? So you can't just say, well, we'll give you the compensation, okay? They have to be able to say no to that. But if they've got that right to say no at the global level, they've got the capacity to shut down the whole global economy. Now, it's not clear to me how you can determine in terms of justice who should actually have that right. If you spin it the other way around, effectively we have the status quo. If you say, well, it's the developed world which has the property rights, or the would-be developing countries that have got the property rights, and you require that these tribal peoples pay compensation, this is absurd as well. How are people who sort of want to lead an aesthetic life supposed to pay other people to stop polluting? This is a winner-take-all scenario where whoever gets the property rights has basically won the whole game. There are no opportunities left for anybody else. So in this case, I don't think we have any principle of justice which can actually be applied to determine who should have the property rights. In practice, what's likely to happen is that it's going to be rule of the most powerful. Okay? It's not going to be considered in terms of principles of justice. It's going to be the most powerful countries which dictate this issue. That isn't to say that's a satisfactory state of affairs. It's attempting to understand the logic of what is actually happening in this situation. Just to show how alternative theories of justice don't get you any further in this case as well, so I'm not just attacking libertarianism here. Think about the Rawlsian view of justice. Okay, so on a Rawlsian view, what you should be doing is maximizing the position of the worst off. Okay? That's how you determine whether or not justice is being achieved. But in this case, who counts as the worst off? Okay? Are the worst off poor people in developing countries who want to develop, okay, but are going to be prevented from developing by other people who want to lead an aesthetic lifestyle? Or are the worst off actually the people who are penniless but who want to stay that way? How do you decide who the worst off are in that situation to determine who should have the rights? You could go down the Ronald Dworkin route, which is to have equality of resources. But in order to actually decide that you've got equality of resources, as Dworkin himself recognises, you first got to have a market which values those resources. But in this case, the precise problem is that we have one set of people who don't believe that the resources should be a marketable resource. The people who want to lead some kind of ascetic life don't believe in principle that these resources can be valued in some kind of economic market. That's the reason that they turn down the compensation if somebody would actually offer it to them. So I'm submitting here that there is no principle of justice through which we can determine these questions. This is a problem for libertarians, but it's not something that they should be afraid of, because it's a problem for all of the political theories as well. This is the mirage of climate justice. Thank you very much. The problem with the oceans in the sense that it's difficult to establish property rights to them. Okay, it's technologically difficult. However, I think oceanic resources are in a different sort of class. Imagine technology developed which enabled people to fence off various fisheries. Okay, you would then be in a situation analogous to many other property rights situations with ownership of land or what have you, where appropriation by some actors doesn't actually reduce particularly the opportunities which are available for others, because there are going to be other plots of land that people can have. Okay? So you can have your plot of land where you want to farm fish, okay? But somebody else, because the resource can be parceled off in different ways, can also own a property right for conservation purposes, okay? Because you've got a plural problem, it's not something that requires a global solution. You can have property rights devised in such a way which enable people to try out different solutions or different modes of life and can coexist. In the case of climate change, the problem is precisely that there is only one climate. This is the reason why whoever gets property rights is going to be in a winner-take-all situation. It's not that you can have, well, one climate policy here and another one somewhere else where people can try out something different. Maybe in some futuristic scenario, those people who don't like what's going on in Earth can go to Mars or Saturn or whatever it is. But that isn't the case when you're talking about the ocean. Okay? At the moment, we don't have property rights solutions because we don't have the technology. But if you had the technology, it would enable a fragmented solution to emerge where people could do different things. That is not possible, even in principle, in the case of climate change, because there's only one global climatic system.